Welcome to the debate.
Thanks for joining us.
Friday, May 29, 2026. It is 2:35 in the morning. Interstate 95 southbound, right down in Stafford County, Virginia, near the Quantico Marine Base. Now, it's dark, obviously, but this highway is a major artery.
Oh, yeah. It is always pulsing with traffic, commercial and passenger, even in the dead of night.
Exactly. And up ahead on this stretch, there's an active work zone. It's constricted the lanes, the variable message boards are glowing brightly, warning signs are deployed, and traffic is compressing into this tight space. You have a long line of vehicles slowing down, just a river of red taillights breaking in unison.
Right, a very standard, predictable highway hazard. Very standard. But approaching this queue from behind is a commercial passenger motor coach. It's operated by E&P Travel, carrying dozens of people all the way from New York City down to Charlotte, North Carolina. And we have to keep in mind, a motor coach of this size weighs upwards of 40,000 pounds.
Which is massive. I mean, when it's moving at highway speeds, it possesses just an absolutely terrifying amount of kinetic energy.
Terrifying is the word. According to the Virginia State Police and, well, the preliminary federal investigations, as this massive vehicle approached the slowing traffic, it did not stop, it didn't swerve, it just plowed violently, squarely into the rear of the stopped vehicles.
Wow, the physical devastation was absolute. The bus first just annihilated a Chevrolet Suburban. It used its mass to force that massive SUV forward into an Acura SUV, and the impact was so severe that the Acura immediately erupted in flames.
That is just horrific.
It is. And the bus just continued. It was a battering ram of steel and fiberglass, striking 4 additional vehicles before it finally came to a halt. The human toll here is staggering. 5 people were killed in this chain reaction collision, and 44 others were injured.
And I know many of those were life-threatening injuries, right? Requiring emergency multi-surgeon operations at Mary Washington Hospital nearby.
Yeah, exactly. The emergency response was massive. Among the dead was 25-year-old Priscilla Mafalda of Worcester, Massachusetts. She was riding in that initial Suburban. And inside the Acura that caught fire, it was an entire family of 4. The Dantsovs from Greenfield, Massachusetts.
Just a devastating loss.
Dmitry Dantsev, who was 45, a nurse, his wife, Akateria, 44, a hairstylist, and their 2 young children, Emily, who was 13, and Mark, 7. They had emigrated from Moldova back in 2008, and they were driving through the night to reach a family wedding down in South Carolina.
And the detail about the trunk, that they had a trunk filled with homemade desserts Ekateria had spent the previous week preparing. I mean, it just humanizes this tragedy in a way that is so gut-wrenching.
It really does. And Dmitri's brother, Yuri, he was driving in a separate car just a mile up ahead. They were temporarily separated by the flow of traffic, so he was completely unaware of the hellish reality unfolding right behind him.
Unimaginable. Now, the driver of that motor coach, he survived, correct?
Yes. The 48-year-old driver, Jing S. Dong, of Staten Island, New York, survived, and he has now been charged by Virginia prosecutors with 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter, and they are expecting additional charges to follow. He is currently being held without bond.
And prosecutors are stating on the record that he drove in a, quote, criminally negligent manner.
Right. But this specific tragedy has instantly transcended the local courtroom in Virginia. It sparked a fierce, highly polarized national debate. And that firestorm was catalyzed directly by U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy.
Yeah, he didn't hold back in his press conference following the crash.
Not at all. Secretary Duffy revealed a really critical piece of information. Jing Dong is a naturalized citizen who received his commercial driver's license, his CDL, from the state of New York in 2024. But he does not speak English.
Which is a requirement.
It is a federal requirement. Duffy publicly condemned this as a regulatory failure, stating unambiguously that if a driver cannot read road signs or communicate with law enforcement, they have no business driving a bus.
Which really frames the entire debate we are having today. Are we looking at a catastrophic failure of systemic CDL licensing requirements,
Or does focusing on a language requirement obscure the terrifying reality of strict individual driver accountability and severe behavioral negligence?
That is exactly the core issue. Now, before we dive deeply into the physical anatomy of this crash, the history of Virginia manslaughter precedent, and the really complex, often reactive, architecture of commercial vehicle regulation, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to ensure you never miss our in-depth analysis of the most pressing issues of our time.
Yes, please do.
Also, before we proceed, a quick status update on Martin Stevens v. OpenAI. Please note this is not a lawsuit. There's currently a voluntary quiet period. The dead man switch has not been activated, and Martin Stevens remains safe.
All right, so let's get into the abyss of commercial highway safety.
Yes, today we are examining the Virginia bus crash, the complex web of CDL qualifications, and the regulatory architecture that governs exactly who is allowed to pilot 40,000 pounds of steel down our interstates.
Right.
So I will be arguing that the tragedy on I-95 is fundamentally a systemic failure. It is rooted in compromised CDL licensing pipelines and the blatant bypassing of language qualification standards. By putting an unqualified driver behind the wheel, the regulatory framework and the licensing state really made themselves complicit in the reckless disregard that led directly to this crash.
And I will be taking the opposing view today, because while I agree that licensing loopholes and language proficiency are completely valid regulatory concerns, they absolutely deserve auditing, they are not the mechanism of this specific tragedy.
You don't think so?
No, I don't. This crash is fundamentally an individual, behavioral failure of severe, catastrophic negligence. The specific physical mechanics of this event, maintaining a high rate of speed and failing to apply the brakes into a wall of stopped traffic, represents a total breakdown of a driver's basic duty to operate heavy machinery.
But that duty is tied to the licensing.
Well, let me just finish the thought. The law properly addresses this not through administrative licensing hearings about language, but through involuntary manslaughter charges and strict CDL disqualifications.
Okay, well, to lay out my position clearly from the start, context is everything here. And the context is the vehicle itself. When we are talking about commercial motor vehicles, or CMVs, we are not talking about a Honda Civic drifting into a bike lane.
No, certainly not.
We are talking about massive, heavy pieces of machinery that operate at 70 miles per hour, and in the case of a motor coach, they are responsible for dozens of human lives right there in the cabin, and hundreds of lives on the highway around them.
The physics are entirely different.
Entirely, because of the sheer physics involved, the extended stopping distances, the blind spots, that catastrophic force of impact. Drivers of these vehicles must be held to the highest possible standard of situational awareness. And I believe Secretary Duffy is absolutely correct to focus on the systemic failure here, because it highlights a breach in the very first line of defense.
The CDL issuing process.
Right. Jing Dong was licensed in New York State in 2024. Yet, according to the federal government, he lacks the English proficiency explicitly required by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the FMCSA.
Right, the language mandate.
And these rules are not arbitrary bureaucratic red tape, they are functional safety requirements. If a driver cannot cognitively process and read variable digital road signs, I mean the exact kind of sequential signs that warn of a work zone ahead, or detail sudden lane closures, or flash speed limit reductions on a dark stretch of I-95, then they are flying blind.
Well, they can see the cars.
But they lack anticipation. If they cannot communicate effectively with law enforcement or emergency responders during an incident, they fundamentally lack the situational awareness required to safely operate a commercial bus. So therefore, this crash cannot be written off as just one individual making a terrible mistake in the middle of the night.
You see it as broader than that.
Much broader. It's a profound structural failure of the CDL schools that trained him, the certified examiners who passed him, and the state licensing bodies that effectively bypassed federal safety mechanisms to hand an unqualified driver the keys to a rolling missile. The system failed the Dansaf family and Priscilla Mafalda in 2024, long before that bus ever crossed the Virginia state line.
Okay, I hear your emphasis on the system, and I don't disagree that a failure at the DMV is a problem.
But I have to counter that by pointing out how focusing on this licensing loophole dangerously obscures the terrifying physical reality of what actually occurred on the asphalt on May 29th.
How does it obscure it? The physical reality is a result of the loophole.
Because if we look at the preliminary findings from the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, and specifically the statements from NTSB board member Tom Chapman, the physical evidence paints a completely different picture of causality.
Okay.
Chapman noted that the bus was moving at a high rate of speed into slowing traffic with virtually no braking. None.
Because he couldn't read the warning signs?
Think about the physics you just mentioned yourself. The sheer severity of striking a Chevy Suburban with such force that it acts as a kinetic wedge, propelling into an Acura, causing the Acura to rupture and catch fire. And then the bus continuing its momentum to strike 4 additional vehicles. That does not describe a driver who was simply confused by the wording on a sign.
Then what does it describe?
It suggests a profound, absolute behavioral negligence. We are likely looking at severe fatigue, total inattention, microsleeps, or extreme distraction. Virginia's manslaughter laws and the entire architecture of CDL disqualifications exist specifically to punish this exact kind of individual behavioral breakdown.
But again, the behavior is linked to the training.
A driver's failure to move their foot to the brake pedal when approaching a glowing wall of red taillights has absolutely nothing to do with their ability to conjugate English verbs or read an overhead message board. Framing this purely as a language issue misses the core proximate cause of the tragedy.
Which you argue is what?
The driver's total disconnect from the physical act of operating heavy machinery. Period.
But you can't decouple the physical act of driving from the cognitive requirements of the regulatory system. Let's dig deeply into the anatomy of the crash itself and how it intersects with Virginia's manslaughter law, because understanding the exact legal mechanism prosecutors are using is really crucial here.
Yeah, the legal framework in Virginia is fascinating and highly specific.
Exactly. We have to meticulously reconstruct this. It is 2:35 a.m. The location is southbound I-95 near Quantico. Now, anyone who has driven the Eastern Seaboard knows this stretch.
Oh, absolutely. It is a notoriously busy, tightly packed corridor, even in the middle of the night.
Right. There was an active work zone. The Virginia State Police confirmed that traffic was slowing down. The environment was reacting to a constriction. And the driver, Jing Dong, is facing 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter. He's being held without bond. The prosecutors are explicitly stating he drove in a, quote, criminally negligent manner.
Which carries very specific weight in that state.
Right, because how we legally define criminal negligence in this specific state is highly complex. Virginia's legal framework for manslaughter is somewhat unique compared to other states, isn't it? It's not just a matter of checking boxes in a penal code.
No, it's not, and it's vital to understand why the prosecutors are pursuing these specific charges and not others. If you go to a state like New York or California, they have very strict, rigidly codified statutory definitions for every single degree of homicide.
Like vehicular manslaughter in the 2nd degree, 1st degree, that sort of thing?
Exactly. The statutes define the exact parameters in black and white. But Virginia operates differently. It relies heavily on common law.
Meaning case law?
Right. This means that the definitions of manslaughter aren't just written in a single statute book. They are defined by centuries of appellate court decisions that establish precedent. This common law system gives the courts flexibility to evaluate the specific nuance of a case, but it also requires a very precise understanding of legal history to know what actually constitutes manslaughter.
So how does it break down?
Well, in Virginia, homicide generally breaks down into murder, which requires malice aforethought, and manslaughter, which lacks malice. Manslaughter itself splits into 2 main categories: voluntary and involuntary.
Okay.
Voluntary manslaughter is an intentional killing, but one committed without malice. The classic legal framing is a crime of passion, something committed in the heat of the moment upon reasonable provocation.
Like a sudden fight.
Right. Think of a sudden, unplanned bar fight where someone strikes a lethal blow, or a domestic dispute that instantly turns lethal, or a severe overreaction in self-defense. There is a clear intent to inflict harm in that exact moment, but it lacks the cold, premeditated calculation required for a murder charge.
And clearly, looking at the physics and the context of this incident, voluntary manslaughter doesn't apply to a commercial bus crash. Jing Dong didn't intentionally aim his bus at the Doncef family in a fit of rage. There was no intent to kill.
Exactly. There is zero evidence of intent to harm. So that brings us to involuntary manslaughter, which is the accidental killing of another individual. Under Virginia case law, this occurs in one of two ways.
Which are?
First, during the commission of an unlawful act that is not a felony, such as a severe traffic violation. Second, during the performance of a lawful act, like driving a vehicle, that is performed improperly or with criminal negligence.
Okay, so a lawful act performed improperly.
Right. The case law is full of examples. Discharging a hunting rifle into a dense forest without checking if people are around, mistaking the brake pedal for the accelerator in a crowded parking lot, or, very commonly, driving while severely intoxicated. In Virginia, standard involuntary manslaughter is a Class 5 felony. It carries up to 10 years in prison, though the judge maintains the discretion to sentence the defendant to less than a year in jail, depending on the circumstances.
Right. But I don't think standard involuntary manslaughter captures the severity of what prosecutors are looking at here. We really need to look closer at the threshold for what Virginia specifically defines as aggravated involuntary manslaughter.
You think it crosses that line?
I do. I see why you think that a behavioral failure like falling asleep or not braking is enough to satisfy the standard involuntary charge. But let me give you a different perspective. Doesn't the sheer, unmitigated force of hitting 6 cars without even attempting to brake elevate this from a tragic, ordinary accident to an act of wanton recklessness?
Well, wanton is a strong legal term.
But it applies. In Virginia, aggravated involuntary manslaughter requires conduct that is so gross, wanton, and culpable as to show a reckless disregard for human life. And the penalty jumps significantly. It's not a maximum of 10 years. It carries a mandatory minimum of 1 year and a maximum of 20 years in prison.
Right. The stakes are much higher.
When you consider the environment, operating a 40,000-pound commercial motor coach at 2:35 a.m., failing entirely to reduce speed for a marked work zone, and striking a passenger vehicle with such catastrophic kinetic energy that it crushes the vehicle in front of it and kills 5 people instantly. Isn't that the very definition of a gross, wanton disregard for human life?
It's certainly a strong argument for the prosecution.
And furthermore, doesn't that suggest that putting an unqualified, non-English-speaking driver in that seat is the systemic failure that created that wanting condition in the first place?
See, I come at it from a completely different way. I actually agree with you that the threshold for aggravated involuntary manslaughter might very well be met in this case. But rather than proving your point about systemic or licensing failures, the concept of reckless disregard completely reinforces my point that this is a localized, individual, behavioral failure.
How so?
You mentioned the kinetic energy and the lack of braking. Let's look at the NTSB's preliminary statements. Tom Chapman said, and I quote, "It seems fairly clear that if there was any braking, there wasn't much, because of the speed and severity of the collision."
Exactly. No braking.
Right. That right there is the crux of the legal issue. The conduct that elevates a crash to a wanton and culpable disregard for human life isn't the fact that a clerk in New York might have rubber-stamped his CDL paperwork 2 years ago. The wanton disregard is the real-time physical decision to barrel into a line of stopped or slowing cars without touching the brakes.
But why didn't he touch the brakes? Because he didn't know he had to.
That indicates a complete and utter disconnect from the physical act of driving. I don't care if you speak English, Mandarin, Spanish, or if you don't speak a single human language at all. A glowing red brake light in the darkness in front of you is a universal language. It means stop.
A red light is a red light, yes.
The failure to respond to the basic physical environment directly in front of the windshield transcends any language barrier or DMV test. The law punishes the behavior behind the wheel in that exact moment at 2:35 a.m., not the bureaucratic process that happened hundreds of miles away and months prior.
That's an interesting point. And the visual of the glowing red brake lights is compelling, I'll admit. Though I would frame the reality of commercial driving quite differently. You say a red light is a universal language. But commercial highway navigation at 70 miles per hour isn't just about staring blindly at the bumper 5 feet in front of you.
It's about maintaining a safe following distance.
It is entirely about anticipation. It's about reading the environment miles before you ever see those brake lights. And this brings us directly to U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy's critique, and the FMCSA's English proficiency requirement.
Okay, let's look at the requirement.
Let's look at the actual regulation. Under 49 CFR Part 391.11b2, a person is qualified to drive a commercial motor vehicle if they can read and speak the English language sufficiently to converse with the general public, to understand highway traffic signs and signals in the English language, to respond to official inquiries, and to make entries on reports and records.
Yes, that is the letter of the law.
Secretary Duffy explicitly pointed out that Dong is a naturalized citizen who doesn't speak English, and yet he received his New York CDL in 2024. Let's think about the cognitive reality of modern interstate driving. Approaching a work zone on I-95 at night isn't a sudden surprise event that just materializes out of the darkness.
Usually there are warnings.
You have a sequence of warnings. You have variable message boards. You have digital signs that say things like work zone 1 mile, merge left, speed limit 45, or accident ahead, be prepared to stop. Interpreting those signs requires cognitive language proficiency.
It requires reading. Yes.
It requires the brain to process written English at high velocity, translate that information, and initiate a mechanical response, lifting the foot off the accelerator, engaging the jake brake, preparing the air brakes. If New York State issued a commercial license to someone who cannot read these signs, they haven't just made a paperwork error. They have effectively bypassed a critical, legally mandated safety mechanism designed to provide that vital anticipation time.
Okay, I understand the theory of cognitive processing, but is there any empirical evidence that the inability to read a specific warning sign is what caused this specific crash? I mean, are we just assuming he was staring at a sign in confusion?
The evidence is the exact thing you just highlighted earlier, the lack of braking. If you don't know the work zone is coming because you cannot read the 3 sequential warning signs leading up to it, you maintain your highway speed until you are right on top of the traffic queue.
But he still had to see the cars.
By the time you finally see those universal red taillights you mentioned, it's too late. The physics take over. A 40,000-pound motor coach traveling at 70 miles per hour has a massive stopping distance. You have perception reaction time, which is usually 1.5 to 2.5 seconds, during which the bus travels hundreds of feet before the driver even touches the pedal.
Yes, the lag is significant.
Then you have brake lag in an air brake system. By the time the pads engage, if you are only reacting to the cars directly in front of you rather than the signs a mile back, you do not have the physical distance to stop. That is why Secretary Duffy stated, if you can't be properly trained, read our road signs, or communicate with law enforcement, you have no business driving a bus.
Well, Duffy has his political motivations as well.
Maybe. But Duffy is promising intense federal scrutiny on any company, trainer, or school that contributed to this pipeline. Let's look at the company E&P Travel, Inc. They are based in Kings Mountain, North Carolina. They were just incorporated in November 2023 by a person named Shuo Liu.
They're a relatively new operation then.
Very new. According to the FMCSA database, prior to this crash, they operated 4 vehicles and had 11 drivers. They had a satisfactory safety rating and only 1 injury accident in 2 years. How does a company with a clean, satisfactory federal safety record end up employing a driver who federal regulations explicitly state should never have been licensed in the first place?
It's a fair question.
It points to a completely broken certification pipeline. It means a third-party testing system is flawed. It means a safety rating system that passengers rely on to book a ticket is a mirage.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Focusing obsessively on the English language requirement right now is a massive political and regulatory distraction from the actual terrifying realities of nighttime commercial driving.
A distraction?
Yes, you are building this elaborate, hypothetical timeline where the driver was actively engaged, fully alert, looking at the road, scanning the horizon, but just couldn't quite translate the specific phrasing of the work zone sign.
It's not hypothetical if he couldn't read English.
But that theory completely ignores the horrifying survivor testimony we already have from the scene. We have first-hand accounts from surviving passengers, Rhonda Wright and Wayne Tobin, who were interviewed right outside Mary Washington Hospital while still covered in the aftermath of the crash.
What did they say?
They didn't describe a driver who missed a sign at the last second. They reported that the driver was reckless and the bus was traveling at, quote, extremely high speeds well before the crash ever occurred.
Passengers aren't always the best judge of highway speed in the dark, though.
Maybe. But they sensed something was deeply wrong structurally with how the vehicle was being operated long before they approached the Quantico work zone. Wright said that after the initial massive impact with the Suburban, the bus was still going, still hitting cars. She said the passengers felt like they were in a death trap because there was absolutely no indication that the driver was trying to stop the bus even after the first collision.
That is chilling.
Tobin emerged covered in blood from other passengers. Wright described seeing people's teeth knocked out. These are visceral, horrific details of a kinetic event, and they do not describe a driver who is a victim of a translation error.
What do they describe, then?
They describe a driver who had fundamentally lost control of the vehicle, or who is experiencing profound fatigue, microsleeps, or total cognitive detachment from reality. If a bus keeps accelerating and plowing through 6 distinct vehicles after the initial impact, that is not an inability to read English. That is a total behavioral collapse.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you're treating this behavioral collapse as something that just spontaneously generates in a vacuum, entirely disconnected from the system that put the driver there.
It generates from human biology and bad choices, not paperwork.
But why do we have systemic regulations like language proficiency, background checks, and stringent CDL testing in the first place? Precisely because human behavior does collapse. We know that commercial driving is brutal. We know that night driving, grueling turnaround schedules, and driver fatigue are endemic, systemic issues in the commercial bus industry. The NTSB has been tracking this for decades.
I agree that fatigue is endemic.
Right, because we know the job pushes human endurance to the breaking point. The regulatory gates at the front end, like strict CDL testing and the English language proficiency mandate, become even more vital. They act as proxies for overall competence, rigorous training, and a willingness to adhere to strict rules.
Proxies?
Yes. Think about the implications of the loophole. If a CDL school, a third-party tester, or a state DMV examiner is willing to forge, overlook, or pencil whip a federal language requirement just to push a driver through the system in 2024 to fill a labor shortage, what other mandatory safety training did they skip?
Well, that's speculation.
Is it? If they didn't care that he couldn't read a highway sign, did they actually take the time to adequately train him on emergency air brake recovery? Did they train him on evasive maneuvers? Did they train him on federal hours of service regulations and fatigue management?
We don't know that yet.
The language requirement isn't just about reading a sign. It is the canary in the coal mine for systemic regulatory capture. If the licensing system fails on something as basic and obvious as English proficiency, we have to assume it fails on everything else.
That's a compelling argument, and I appreciate the idea of the language requirement acting as a proxy for overall training quality. But have you considered that strict, absolute enforcement of the language requirement wouldn't actually solve the root cause of these specific fatalities?
How so?
If politicians and regulators fixate solely on whether commercial drivers can speak English, they can politically pat themselves on the back, hold press conferences, and claim they solved the problem, all while completely ignoring the dark underbelly of the motor coach industry.
Which is what?
Let's look at the data. Following a series of horrific motor coach crashes in 2008 that killed 41 people nationwide, the Department of Transportation was forced to publish a comprehensive motor coach safety action plan. The NTSB investigated 16 fatal motor coach crashes that occurred between 1998 and 2008.
And what did they find?
Their findings were definitive. Driver-related problems, specifically fatigue, medical conditions, and inattention, accounted for 56% of the accidents and a staggering 60% of the fatalities. Fatigue is the true systemic danger on the highway at 2:30 in the morning, not vocabulary.
But vocabulary is a safety tool.
A native-born English speaker with a PhD in literature who is pushed by their dispatcher to drive a route from New York City to Charlotte in the middle of the night without adequate sleep is just as deadly, possesses the exact same amount of uncontrolled kinetic energy as someone who can't read a single road sign.
That's a dramatic example, but I see your point.
By making this a highly publicized debate about language and naturalized citizens, Secretary Duffy is actually avoiding the much harder, much more expensive conversation. He's avoiding talking about the brutal economics of the curbside bus industry, the low driver compensation that forces drivers to work multiple jobs, and the physical limits of human circadian rhythms.
But you can't artificially separate the economics of the industry from the licensing loopholes. They are part of the exact same systemic failure.
How are they the same?
The low-cost economics of the curbside bus industry rely entirely on exploiting a driver pool that is often marginalized, economically desperate, or newly arrived. That is exactly why these licensing loopholes exist and why third-party testers are incentivized to push unqualified drivers through the system.
So you're saying the language loophole is a symptom of the economic pressure?
Exactly. Let's look at precedent. Because the tragic reality is that this is not the first time the state of Virginia has seen a catastrophic bus crash with these exact same dynamics on this exact same highway.
You're absolutely right to bring up precedent, but I think the precedent actually proves my point about individual behavioral choices and fatigue over systemic language requirements.
Let's hear it.
Let's talk in depth about the 2011 Sky Express bus crash. This is a chillingly similar historical comparison that everyone analyzing the E&P travel crash needs to understand. On May 30, 2011, almost exactly 15 years prior to this crash, to the day, a Sky Express motor coach heading from Greensboro, North Carolina to New York City veered off Interstate 95 about 30 miles north of Richmond.
Also in Virginia.
Also in Virginia. The bus hit an embankment and overturned. 4 passengers were killed and dozens were severely injured. The driver in that case was a man named Kin-Yu Chung. In 2012, after a thorough investigation and trial, Chung was convicted of 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter.
4 counts.
Yes. The Virginia Court of Appeals eventually reviewed the case and upheld his 6-year prison sentence.
And what were the specific facts of his negligence that led the appellate court to uphold manslaughter conviction? Because it wasn't just a simple accident.
No, the facts were entirely behavioral, and they centered entirely on fatigue and the conscious choice to ignore it. The NTSB conducted a massive investigation and concluded that driver fatigue was the primary contributing factor to the crash, largely because Chung had limited opportunities for quality sleep in the days prior to the trip.
So systemic economic pressure again.
But it wasn't just that he was tired. It was his behavior leading up to the crash. Witnesses at his trial testified to a truly harrowing experience in the cabin. They saw the bus swerving from side to side across lanes and changing speeds erratically for up to an hour before the crash actually occurred.
Wow, an hour?
An hour. They testified that they saw Chung guzzling coffee and multiple energy drinks he had picked up at various stops, desperately trying to artificially keep himself awake. Most damningly, when the bus hit the rumble strips on the shoulder of the highway, passengers saw him physically slump to the right with his head resting on his shoulder.
Okay, that is clearly behavioral negligence.
And here is where the language aspect actually worked against him, proving the point about individual culpability. A passenger on the bus who spoke Mandarin overheard Chang on a cell phone earlier in the trip. He was telling someone in his native language that he wasn't getting enough rest and was exhausted.
So he knew.
The Virginia Court of Appeals ruled that there was ample, undeniable evidence that Chang knew he was in no condition to drive. He recognized his severely impaired condition, he articulated it, he tried to combat it with caffeine, and yet he consciously chose to keep his foot on the accelerator. He made a behavioral choice that posed a massive, lethal risk to the 57 passengers on board.
I see.
This precedent proves that gross behavioral negligence, the act of ignoring one's own bodily fatigue and actively choosing to operate a commercial vehicle anyway, is the ultimate cause of these tragedies. The law prosecuted his behavior, his decision-making in the cabin of that bus in the middle of the night. It didn't prosecute his paperwork.
I think the Sky Express case is a perfect pivot point, actually. But I'm going to use it to discuss the architecture of CDL disqualifications. Because what the Sky Express case actually shows is how the legal and regulatory system tries to act as a safety net, but fundamentally does so too late. The entire system of accountability you are relying on is entirely reactive.
Reactive? How so?
Let's look at the strict penalties CDL holders face, because obtaining a CDL is a privilege that comes with immense legal exposure. It's not like a standard driver's license. According to both Virginia law and overarching federal FMCSA standards, CDL disqualifications are tiered based on the severity of the offense.
Right. There are 1-year, 3-year, and lifetime bans.
Exactly. For example, a 1-year disqualification happens for driving a commercial vehicle with a blood alcohol content of 0.04. Now, why 0.04? Why is it exactly half the legal limit of 0.08 for a civilian driver? Because regulators understand the physics. They understand that a 40,000-pound vehicle has zero margin for error, and even slight cognitive impairment vastly increases perception reaction time.
Right. The standards are much stricter.
That same 1-year disqualification triggers for refusing a breath test, leaving the scene of an accident, using a CMV to commit a felony, or falsifying a urine test. If a driver is transporting hazardous materials, the stakes are higher, and those same offenses trigger a 3-year disqualification. And if you receive a second conviction for any of those major offenses, it results in a lifetime disqualification from ever holding a CDL again.
Right, and there are specific, highly punitive disqualifications regarding fatalities that apply directly to cases like Jingdong and Qin Yu Cheng.
Exactly. Causing a fatality through the negligent operation of a commercial motor vehicle results in a standard 1-year disqualification. But there's a specific escalated 5-year disqualification if you are convicted of voluntary or involuntary manslaughter, where a death occurred as a direct result of operating a CMV.
Which is a heavy administrative penalty on top of the prison time.
Right. That is precisely the legal mechanism that will strip Jingdong of his livelihood if he is ultimately convicted of the manslaughter charges he currently faces in Stafford County. But here is my fundamental issue with your reliance on this framework. This entire architecture is entirely reactive.
It's a punishment.
It is a punishment, not a prevention. It disqualifies a driver after the Dontsev family has been killed. It strips the license after Priscilla Mafalda loses her life. It revokes Qin Yu Cheng's CDL only after his bus is overturned in a ditch with 4 people dead. If the system only works by counting the bodies after the fact, it's a failed system.
But you are ignoring the fact that there are proactive measures built into the system too. It's not entirely reactive to fatalities. It reacts to behavioral patterns.
Like what?
Let's look at the point system. Virginia's Department of Motor Vehicles tracks CDL driving record points incredibly aggressively. If a commercial driver accumulates 18 demerit points in a 12-month period or 24 points in a 24-month period, it triggers an automatic 90-day suspension of their commercial driving privileges.
A 90-day suspension. Sure.
And it doesn't stop there. After that 90-day suspension is served, the driver is placed on a strict 6-month probationary period. During that probation, any moving violation, even a minor one, triggers another immediate suspension.
But again, you have to commit violations first.
Furthermore, there are specific 60-day and 120-day disqualifications for accumulating what the FMCSA categorizes as serious traffic violations. We are talking about things like driving 15 miles per hour or more over the posted speed limit, erratic or improper lane changes, following another vehicle too closely, or texting while operating a CMV. The regulatory system does attempt to weed out risky, negligent behavioral patterns proactively long before they result in a fatal crash.
Does it, though? Let's apply that logic to the timeline we are actually dealing with in the ENP travel crash. Jang Dong received his New York CDL in 2024. The crash on I-95 happened in May 2026. He had barely been in the system for 2 years.
True, a relatively short career.
If the initial licensing process is structurally compromised, if language tests are bypassed by corrupt or overworked examiners, if training hours are rushed or pencil-whipped, the point system simply doesn't have enough runway to catch the bad driver before a tragedy occurs. You are relying on a driver to accumulate speeding tickets safely so you can pull their license before they kill someone. That is a massive gamble.
It's an imperfect system, I'll grant you that.
Let me offer an analogy to clarify this. If a commercial airline pilot crashes a Boeing 737 into the ground, The NTSB doesn't just ask if the pilot was tired that night or if he ignored the altitude warnings in the cockpit. The very first thing investigators do is ask how the airline and the FAA cleared him to fly in the first place if he couldn't read the instruments.
The aviation standards are entirely different.
But the principle is the same. They audit the FAA examiners. They audit the flight school. They look at his simulator scores. CDL disqualifications and the point system are the safety net. But shouldn't the initial licensing process, the English proficiency test, the road skills test, be the locked door? If the locked door is broken at the DMV, the safety net is eventually going to tear under the sheer weight of all the unqualified drivers passing through it.
I agree that the locked door needs to be secure. No one in the industry is arguing that we should just hand out CDLs to unqualified applicants like candy.
Well, it seems like someone in New York was.
But I have to push back fiercely on your pilot analogy because it highlights exactly where your systemic argument disconnects from reality. A commercial airline pilot is operating in a highly complex, three-dimensional environment, heavily reliant on complex, computer-generated instrument readings to land a plane, often in zero visibility.
Yes.
They must communicate constantly with air traffic control using highly specific, codified aviation English. If they can't speak the language or read the instruments, they cannot fly the plane.
And a bus driver needs to read signs.
A bus driver on Interstate 95 is operating in a two-dimensional environment. They are relying on basic human eyesight and fundamental motor skills to navigate a highway. You do not need FAA clearance or perfect English grammar to know what a wall of glowing red brake lights means.
I still disagree that it's just about the lights.
A locked door at the DMV in New York in 2024 does not reach out of the past and press the physical brake pedal on I-95 in Virginia at 2:35 a.m. in 2026. Once that 40,000-pound vehicle is at highway speed in the middle of the night, the paperwork ceases to matter.
The training matters.
The only thing keeping the passengers in that cabin safe, and the only thing keeping the families in the cars ahead of them safe, is the driver's behavioral commitment to the heavy machinery they control. No amount of pristine paperwork, perfectly administered language tests, or systematic federal audits can substitute for a driver simply staying awake, maintaining their attention on the horizon, and applying the brakes when traffic stops.
But that's exactly what the regulations are supposed to ensure.
The law recognizes this fundamental truth through the severity of involuntary manslaughter charges. We hold the individual accountable in criminal court because, ultimately, when the rubber meets the road, they are the one holding the weapon.
As we begin to summarize our positions and look at the broader implications of this debate, I want to bring this back to the macro view of highway safety.
Sure.
The Stafford County tragedy on May 29th exposes a gaping, undeniable hole in how we credential commercial drivers in this country. While individual accountability is undeniably paramount, and if the evidence proves gross negligence, Jing Dong should absolutely face the consequences of the law. We cannot ignore that the system that placed him behind the wheel is deeply structurally flawed.
I don't deny the system has flaws.
When federal language barriers are intentionally ignored, and when licensing loopholes are exploited by companies prioritizing cheap labor and profit margins over public safety, we create systemic ticking time bombs on our highways. Secretary Duffy's commitment to investigating the New York licensing records and the specific training documentation of EMP travel is not a political distraction. It is a necessary reckoning. Until we fix the pipeline that certifies these drivers and secure the locked door, we are simply waiting for the next catastrophe to unfold in the dark.
And my summary remains intensely focused on the physical evidence at the scene and the reality of human behavior. While systemic checks are absolutely necessary, and regulatory audits of testing facilities should occur regularly, the devastating physical evidence of this specific crash cannot be ignored.
The physics of the crash.
Yes. A motor coach traveling at high speeds, making zero attempt to brake, plowing into stopped traffic with enough force to crush vehicles and cause a massive fire, and then continuing to strike more cars, points to profound, severe behavioral negligence.
Even if he didn't know he was supposed to stop.
The fact that surviving passengers felt they were trapped in a reckless death trap well before the impact even occurred speaks to a fundamental loss of control that transcends any language barrier. The law rightly pursues this as aggravated involuntary manslaughter because the ultimate non-transferable responsibility for a 40,000-pound vehicle rests squarely on the shoulders of the person sitting in the driver's seat.
Well, I think where we fundamentally converge today, regardless of our views on systemic versus individual failure, is in the acknowledgement of the absolute heartbreak of this event.
Unquestionably.
The loss of 25-year-old Priscilla Mafalda, who had her whole life ahead of her. The complete erasure of the Dontsev family, Dmitry, Ekaterina, 13-year-old Emily, and 7-year-old Mark, who were simply driving through the night to celebrate a family wedding, carrying homemade desserts. This is a devastating multi-generational tragedy, and it underscores the massive, literal life-or-death responsibility that CDO holders bear every single time they turn the ignition.
Absolutely. The human cost here is beyond words, and our deepest sympathies must remain with the victims and their extended families, like Dmitry's brother, Yuri, who has to live with the aftermath of being just a mile up the road.
Yeah, just unimaginable.
We also agree that the forthcoming, comprehensive NTSB investigation will be absolutely crucial. That process will take months. It is entirely separate from the Virginia State Police's criminal case. The NTSB will retrieve the heavy vehicle event data recorder, the black box. They will analyze the tire marks, the brake lines, and the driver's logbooks.
It will be incredibly thorough.
That exhaustive process will be essential in untangling exactly how the driver biologically and behaviorally failed in those final moments, and exactly how the regulatory system may have failed to properly screen him beforehand.
Exactly. It highlights the value of looking at these incredibly complex tragedies through both lenses simultaneously. Making our highways truly safer requires a two-pronged approach. We must prosecute the extreme negligence of the driver in the seat, ensuring that behavioral collapse has severe consequences. But we must also relentlessly reform the bureaucracy and the licensing pipelines that put that driver in the seat in the first place.
We need both.
Right. If we don't address both the individual and the system, we honor neither the victims nor the law. If my pilot analogy holds true, even if you dispute the complexity of the instruments, the core philosophy remains. We need both better, more attentive pilots and the flawless control tower that ensures only the qualified get to fly.
It's a tall order, but it's what public safety demands.
Thank you for joining us for this rigorous exploration of law, regulation, physics, and responsibility. If you appreciate discussions that push past the surface level sound bites and dive deeply into the evidence, the history, and the complexities of our world, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share the show with someone who values nuanced debate.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
We'll see you next time on The Debate. But until then, ask yourself, when disaster strikes on the open road, is it the fault of the hands on the wheel or the system that handed them the keys?